In the dimly lit laundry room of Birmingham Women's Correctional Facility, the lifeless body of Kiana Jackson was found sprawled on the cold concrete floor. Blood pooled beneath her head, stark against the dull gray surface. A heavy wrench, faintly stained and eerily out of place, had been carefully wiped clean of fingerprints and returned to its spot on the tool shelf, as if someone had deliberately erased the violence that had just occurred. The faint hum of industrial washers and dryers was the only sound, masking the silence that spoke louder than words. This wasn't an ordinary prison altercation. The scene told a story of calculation, precision, and rage. What investigators uncovered next: hidden letters, falsified logs, and mounting evidence of a secret relationship, would unravel a shocking web of manipulation, emotional vulnerability, and betrayal. How does a corrections officer, sworn to uphold the rules, become entangled in a forbidden connection with an inmate? What drives someone to cross the line between duty and desire, leading to consequences as fatal as murder? Today, we're diving into the chilling story of Danielle Roberts and Kiana Jackson, a case that blurs the boundaries between professionalism and personal weakness, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and blood. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Vic's True Crime Stories for more gripping narratives just like this. And if this story draws you in, share it with a friend who loves exploring the hidden and often disturbing sides of human nature. Now, let's uncover how one relationship unraveled into tragedy. The discovery of Kiana Jackson's lifeless body sent shockwaves through Birmingham Women's Correctional Facility. The grim scene in the laundry room triggered an immediate lockdown. Gates slammed shut, and guards scrambled to secure every corner of the prison, ushering inmates back to their cells as chaos rippled through the corridors. The hum of the industrial washers now seemed deafening against the stark stillness that followed. Within hours, Detective Elijah Pierce arrived to take charge of the investigation. Known for his methodical approach and sharp intuition, Pierce wasted no time surveying the scene. Something about the murder felt too deliberate. The wrench, cleaned of any discernible fingerprints yet faintly blood-stained, had been placed back on the shelf with unsettling precision. No signs of struggle littered the room, just the chilling evidence of a calculated act. Then there was the surveillance issue. The cameras covering adjacent areas of the facility had mysteriously malfunctioned, leaving no visual record of what had happened inside the laundry room. For Pierce, these details didn't align with the chaotic nature of typical prison violence. Something, or someone, had meticulously engineered the circumstances. As investigators combed through the evidence, suspicion quickly fell on Carla Brown, an inmate with a known history of violent outbursts. Carla had clashed with Kiana in the past, including a heated argument in the cafeteria just days before. On paper, she was the perfect suspect. The prison logs placed her in the laundry room during the time of the murder, and her reputation as a troublemaker added weight to the case against her. But when Pierce brought Carla in for questioning, her reaction wasn't what he expected. She didn't stumble or falter. She denied the accusations outright, her defiance laced with an uncharacteristic calm. "I wasn't there," she insisted, her voice steady. Witnesses later corroborated her claim, reporting that Carla had been in her cell during the time in question. The logs that had placed her at the scene began to crumble under scrutiny, leaving the investigation with more questions than answers. As the initial narrative unraveled, Pierce's instincts told him that this wasn't a random act of violence. It was something far more complex. With Carla's airtight alibi, attention shifted toward the people tasked with maintaining order within the prison. What Pierce didn't know yet was that the truth was buried in plain sight, hidden within carefully constructed lies and a relationship that had spiraled out of control. Danielle Roberts arrived at the Birmingham Women's Correctional Facility with a mix of ambition and uncertainty. At 30 years old, she was no stranger to the prison system, having spent years working in lower security environments. But this was different. The gray walls seemed taller, the air heavier, and the weight of her new responsibilities more palpable. Maximum security was a world of its own, a place where every movement mattered, every interaction carried risk, and every choice was scrutinized. For Danielle, this new position wasn't just a job. It was a step up in her career, a chance to prove herself in one of the toughest environments Alabama had to offer. Yet, beneath the confident exterior she wore as she walked through the facility gates, there was a loneliness she carried silently, a yearning for something more, something she hadn't found in her years of routine and structure. The sharp glances from the inmates as she passed didn't intimidate her. They only served to remind her of the unspoken tension that defined life within these walls. This wasn't just a test of skill, it was a test of character. It was during her orientation tour, led by seasoned officer Greg Houston, that Danielle first noticed Kiana Jackson. Standing apart from the other inmates, Kiana had an aura that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't loud or confrontational, yet her presence commanded attention. Her neatly braided hair framed her face, and her posture was upright, exuding a quiet confidence that set her apart. While other inmates avoided the guard's gaze or stared with hostility, Kiana's eyes met Danielle's directly, steady, assessing, and oddly magnetic. Kiana Jackson wasn't like the others. She didn't carry the same air of resignation or wear the same hardened expressions. There was a calmness about her, a kind of defiance that wasn't rooted in aggression but in a self-assuredness that made her seem untouchable. It wasn't the typical demeanor of someone serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery, a crime that had taken the life of a security guard. Her presence lingered in Danielle's mind long after the tour moved on. As Danielle continued her first day, familiarizing herself with the routines and absorbing the unspoken rules of the facility, her thoughts kept drifting back to Kiana. There was something about her, something different, something unsettling. It wasn't fear or intimidation that Kiana stirred, it was curiosity, a pull Danielle couldn't quite place. And while Danielle told herself it was simply her training kicking in, her instinct to observe and assess, deep down, she felt it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. At first, their interactions were fleeting. A polite nod in passing, a brief exchange of words about the day's schedule. Danielle Roberts had no intention of forming any sort of personal connection with Kiana Jackson. After all, she was a corrections officer, and Kiana was an inmate. But even the smallest moments can plant the seeds of something larger, and as the days turned into weeks, those brief exchanges began to linger in Danielle's mind. Danielle wasn't just a professional, she was human. Beneath the crisp uniform and calm exterior, there was a profound loneliness that she carried. Years of working in high-pressure environments had left her isolated, with little room for personal connections or emotional fulfillment. She moved through life with the efficiency of someone who had learned to compartmentalize, but inside there was a void. And Kiana Kiana seemed to fill that void. Kiana's stories were what drew Danielle in first. In moments when the facility was quiet, during shifts in the library or near the cell block doors, Kiana began to open up. She spoke about her childhood in Montgomery, about her dreams of one day owning a boutique. Her words carried the weight of regret, but also a glimmer of hope that stood out against the harshness of prison life. Kiana's voice had a way of cutting through Danielle's professional detachment, making her see the person behind the inmate number. But Kiana's openness wasn't entirely spontaneous. Danielle soon noticed how Kiana seemed to position herself in places where their paths would cross. Whether it was a coincidental meeting in the library or her presence near a workstation during Danielle's rounds, Kiana's timing was impeccable. Small notes began to appear, neatly written messages tucked beneath books or left on desks. These weren't overtly personal, but they carried a warmth that was impossible to dismiss. Kiana would thank Danielle for her kindness, for listening without judgment, and for simply acknowledging her humanity in a place designed to strip people of it. Danielle told herself that she was just being polite, that her role as an officer required her to treat every inmate with fairness and respect. But deep down, she knew something was shifting. Kiana wasn't just another inmate anymore. She was someone who made Danielle feel seen, someone who seemed to understand the struggles she didn't share with anyone else. In a high-pressure environment like a prison, emotions run high, for both inmates and staff. The constant vigilance, the unyielding rules, and the weight of responsibility can wear down even the most seasoned officers. Psychologists have noted that these environments often blur the lines between personal and professional boundaries, making staff particularly vulnerable to emotional connections with those they supervise. In Danielle's case, the combination of her loneliness and Kiana's charm created a perfect storm. Kiana had a way of making Danielle feel important, like she mattered in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her resilience and warmth stood in stark contrast to the cold efficiency of the prison system. And while Danielle tried to convince herself that she was still in control, the bond between them was growing stronger with every interaction. It wasn't long before their connection began to blur the line between duty and desire, pulling Danielle further into a relationship that would soon spiral out of control. The bond between Danielle Roberts and Kiana Jackson had started with shared stories and stolen moments of connection. But over time, the warmth that had once defined their relationship began to cool, replaced by something far more dangerous. Kiana's charm and vulnerability, which had drawn Danielle in, gave way to a calculated and chilling determination. It began with subtle suggestions. Kiana would talk about her dreams of freedom, painting vivid pictures of the life she wanted to build outside the prison walls. At first, it seemed harmless, just the wishful thinking of an inmate longing for a second chance. But soon, those conversations took a sharper turn. Kiana started hinting at a plan, dropping suggestions that Danielle could help her escape. Danielle was horrified. She pushed back immediately, reminding herself of her role, her duty. But Kiana didn't relent. Their growing intimacy had given Kiana leverage, and she wasn't afraid to use it. One day, she revealed the evidence she had been quietly gathering: photos, letters, and even recordings documenting their relationship. Images of their stolen moments in the library, fragments of notes passed between them, and audio clips of whispered conversations. The implications were clear. If Danielle didn't cooperate, Kiana would expose everything. What had started as a connection rooted in empathy had transformed into a weapon. Kiana's manipulation left Danielle trapped, her professional life hanging by a thread. She was consumed by fear of losing her job, her reputation, and the life she had built. But more than that, she felt betrayed. The person she had trusted, the person she had allowed herself to care for, had turned on her in the worst way. Then came the day it all unraveled. The laundry room was quiet, the rhythmic hum of industrial washers filling the space with a mechanical monotony. Danielle entered, her palms damp with sweat and her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Kiana was waiting for her, and she knew this confrontation wouldn't end easily. Kiana stood casually by a folding table, her posture confident, almost smug. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed a sharpness that set Danielle on edge. She wasted no time reiterating her demands, her voice steady and laced with the air of someone who held all the power. Danielle tried to reason with her, her voice trembling as she begged Kiana to let it go. But Kiana was unmoved. Her tone shifted, becoming mocking and cruel. She dismissed Danielle's feelings as foolish, belittling the vulnerability Danielle had shown her. "You're so naive," Kiana sneered, her words cutting like a knife. "Did you really think this was anything more than a game?" The months of fear, guilt, and betrayal boiled over in an instant. Danielle's eyes fell on a heavy wrench lying on a nearby shelf. Without fully realizing what she was doing, she reached for it, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold metal. Kiana didn't notice the shift in Danielle's demeanor until it was too late. In a blinding flash of rage, Danielle swung the wrench with all her strength, the impact landing squarely against Kiana's temple. The sound echoed through the room, a sickening thud that marked the breaking point of everything Danielle had been holding inside. Kiana staggered backward, her expression shifting from confidence to shock. She collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath her head, but Danielle didn't stop. The adrenaline coursing through her veins pushed her forward, and she struck again, and again, each blow driven by a primal need to silence the threat that Kiana had become. When it was over, the room fell eerily silent. The steady hum of the machines continued, indifferent to the violence that had just unfolded. Danielle stood over Kiana's lifeless body, the bloodied wrench still clutched in her trembling hands. Her chest heaved with the effort of what she had done, and the enormity of her actions began to sink in. In that moment, the months of fear, guilt, and betrayal erupted in a flash of violence. And now, as the silence closed in around her, Danielle knew there was no turning back. The investigation into Kiana Jackson's murder began with more questions than answers. Detective Elijah Pierce, a seasoned investigator with an eye for detail, quickly sensed that the crime was far from a typical prison altercation. The wiped wrench, the precise placement of the murder weapon, and the lack of surveillance footage painted a picture of calculation, something unusual for crimes of passion within prison walls. As Pierce and his team dug deeper, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source: LaToya Martin, the prison psychologist. LaToya had long observed the emotional dynamics within the facility, and she couldn't ignore the changes she had seen in Danielle Roberts over the past few months. Once composed and confident, Danielle had become increasingly anxious, her behavior marked by nervous glances and unexplained preoccupations. LaToya had also noticed how frequently Danielle lingered near Kiana's cell or spent extended time in the library during Kiana's shifts. When Pierce interviewed LaToya, she hesitated at first, reluctant to accuse a colleague without concrete proof. But as she described Danielle's erratic behavior and the subtle but telling interactions she'd witnessed between Danielle and Kiana, Pierce's suspicions sharpened. The breakthrough came when officers searched Kiana Jackson's cell. Hidden beneath her mattress, they discovered a bundle of letters, pages written in Kiana's neat, deliberate handwriting. These weren't just casual notes. The letters detailed an intimate relationship with Danielle, recounting their secret meetings, stolen moments, and even Kiana's manipulation of Danielle to aid in her escape plan. Some letters were incomplete fragments of ideas and emotions, but collectively, they painted a damning picture of a relationship that had crossed every professional boundary. Among the letters were sketches and small notes from Danielle herself, further implicating her. Pierce now had the evidence he needed to confront Danielle. When Danielle was brought in for questioning, she maintained a stoic exterior, denying any involvement in Kiana's murder. Her voice was steady, and her answers were measured, but Pierce could see the cracks forming beneath her composure. As he laid out the letters, the falsified logs, and the mounting inconsistencies in her statements, Danielle's defenses began to crumble. Faced with the weight of the evidence, and her own guilt, Danielle finally broke down. Her voice shook as she recounted the months of manipulation, the emotional spiral that had consumed her, and the toxic bond she had shared with Kiana. She described how Kiana had used their relationship as leverage, threatening to expose their connection and destroy Danielle's life. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she relived the moment in the laundry room, the anger, the fear, and the wrench in her hand. "I didn't plan it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't take it anymore." Pierce listened as Danielle confessed, his own emotions conflicted. The story she told was one of vulnerability turned against her, of loneliness exploited and trust betrayed. But it was also a story of choices that had led to a violent, irreversible act. Danielle's confession solidified the case. The evidence was undeniable, and her emotional breakdown during the interrogation left no doubt about her guilt. For Pierce, the truth was clear, but the human cost of the tragedy weighed heavily. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was a devastating example of how blurred boundaries and unchecked emotions could spiral into chaos and destruction. The trial of Danielle Roberts moved swiftly. With her confession, the letters, and the falsified records, there was little room for ambiguity. The court laid out the charges: second-degree murder, falsification of records, and gross professional misconduct. Danielle stood silent as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. Her sentence was handed down shortly after, 20 years in the same prison system she had once worked to uphold. It was a cruel twist of fate. The uniform she had once worn with pride was replaced by an inmate's jumpsuit. The officers she had once worked alongside now stood guard over her. And the facility that had once been her workplace was now her home. Danielle's transition from officer to inmate was a bitter irony, one that highlighted just how far she had fallen. As she entered her cell for the first time as a prisoner, the walls that once symbolized her authority now felt suffocating. Her name, once respected among her peers, had become a cautionary tale whispered throughout the halls. For Danielle, The weight of her actions and the betrayal she had allowed to consume her life was inescapable. Detective Elijah Pierce, reflecting on the case, spoke to its deeper implications. "This wasn't just about murder," he explained. "It was about what happens when the lines between professional and personal become blurred. Working in a high-pressure environment like a prison wears people down. Loneliness, isolation. It makes even the strongest people vulnerable. Danielle wasn't just a perpetrator. In some ways, she was a victim too. But that doesn't excuse what she did." LaToya Martin, the prison psychologist, shared similar sentiments. "I saw the signs," she admitted. Danielle was struggling, and Kiana exploited that vulnerability. It's a stark reminder that in environments like this, boundaries are not just important, they're essential. Once you cross them, it's nearly impossible to go back. Danielle's story became a cautionary tale, one that echoed beyond the walls of Birmingham Women's Correctional Facility. It served as a grim reminder of how emotional vulnerabilities can spiral into tragedy when left unchecked, and how quickly trust can turn into manipulation, and manipulation into violence. For Danielle, the aftermath of her choices would be a daily reality. Every clang of the prison gates, every step down the cold gray corridors, was a reminder of what she had lost, not just her career, but her sense of self. And for those who heard her story, it was a warning of the thin line that separates duty from desire, and how easily it can be crossed. What do you think? Was Danielle Roberts a victim of calculated manipulation, or did she allow her emotions to lead her down a path of destruction? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this tragic and complex case. If you found this story as compelling as we did, make sure to subscribe to Vic's True Crime Stories for more gripping and thought-provoking tales just like this one. And don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with friends who are captivated by exploring the darker sides of human behavior and morality. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.